Hey guys, it's Courtney, and I am making a Christmas in July card with the Naughty or Nice Elves set by Simon Says Stamp. This was a limited edition kit, basically. You received all kinds of goodies, and I believe they are sold out now. But I am making a one-layer card here, and I'll be creating a scene. So I am stamping on a piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock, cut down to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, and I'm stamping out my two little elves with Simon Says Stamp Intense Black ink. Now I am masking them with the Simon Says Stamp masking paper, but really this isn't necessary. They aren't being stamped one on top of one another, so this was an unnecessary step right here. I wanted to make it look like they were sitting against some kitchen cabinets, eating their cookies and cookie dough. So I'm taking my pencil and a T-square ruler to just create where my cabinets and where my countertop will be. So I'm just drawing two straight lines here on the top, and this is my counter. And then here on the bottom, I'm going to draw in some vertical lines, and this is where the cabinets will be. I ended up switching it around a little bit because one was completely laying behind that little girl elf. On top of the counter, over here to the left, I'm just kind of freehanding a little mixing bowl. And then over on the right, it will be kind of like a canister or a cookie jar. I started off stamping it or drawing it in the middle, and then decided I wanted that off to the right more so I had room for my sentiment. Once I was happy with my images and the placement of my lines, I went ahead and drew right over top of those with a Copics safe pen. I'm using an Ink-A-Dink-A-Doo journaling pen here. And I'll just use my T-square ruler to go directly over those lines. Once you have your lines drawn in, you want to make sure that you go back in with your pencil to erase any pencil lines that may be showing through. Once you color over them with your Copics, you're not going to be able to erase them. I had a little smudge there. I put the pen down in a place where I didn't intend on it. So I can fix that later. In fact, this card is full of mistakes and all fixable. You may have to change your design a little bit or change the layout, but they are all fixable. I'll go ahead and also go over this little bowl and canister that I just hand drew. I'm not an artist by any means. I stick to straight lines and very, very simple images like this whenever I create a scene. So I'm going to go ahead and erase my pencil lines and remove my masks. Like I said, these masks are not required at all. So being I didn't ink over them or anything like that, I did go ahead and just save them and put them with my stamp set so that the next time I do create a card with this stamp set, I can reuse these masks. Next, we will move on to the Copic coloring, and I'm going to speed this up a lot because the coloring took a very, very long time, especially being I made so many errors. I'm going to start with the cabinets, and these are going to be wood cabinets. So I'm covering up the entire area with my lightest color, which is an E31. This is just to get the paper saturated a little bit and so that I can go around the images. I wasn't all that careful, and I did go over certain areas of the images, but like I said, that's just mistake number 2, and we will fix that later. And next I'll go in with my second to darkest color and create my shadows around these little images. My light source, I'll pretend to be in the top right hand corner, so my shadows for these little characters will be off to the right and underneath them. And I'm basically just outlining where these shadows will be. I'm not doing any kind of flicking. And I'm also going to just draw a straight line where the cabinets would create a shadow as well. Next, I'm going in with that same color, and I'm just really, really quickly barely touching the paper. In fact, I don't always hit the paper. I'm going so light. I'm just drawing little squiggly lines. Some of them are little C shapes, some of them are straight, some of them are little circles, and this will imitate wood grain when we're done. Next, I'll go in with my darkest color, which is the E59, and just intensify some of those shadows. And I'm pretty much just concentrating on the cabinets themselves. And I'll go over some of those little squiggly lines with my darkest color, only where my darkest areas will be. So where the little shadows are from the characters as well as the cabinets themselves. Next, I'll extend those shadows out from the cabinets with that second to darkest color again. Now I'll go in with my lightest mid-tone and extend the shadows out from the characters and the cabinets again. And this time I am starting to flick that color out a little bit just so that I get a better blend. This is a really large area, so it just makes it a little bit easier to blend. I decided to add another shadow off to this to the right just because it was just missing something, so I just added a shadow there as well. Then I went over the entire area again with that lightest color, that E31. I ended up deciding to add a shadow underneath where the countertop is as well. This would hang over the cabinets a little bit, so it would create a shadow. So I went in with my darkest color and just drew a straight line there, flicking that out with my two mid-tone colors, and then going back in again with that lightest color. Now I did go over my image in a lot of different areas. So I'm taking my colorless blender and just using the very tip of that to kind of take away some of that color before I start in with the actual Copic coloring of the images themselves. Some of these areas won't matter. They'll easily be able to be covered up. But for the darker colors like the E57 and 59, they'll be harder to cover up later. Next, I'll move on to the skin tones for these two little characters, and I'm coloring them the same exact way as far as their skin is concerned. Starting off with my lightest color, laying down my darkest areas, which will be underneath where their hair lays over their face. And off to the left-hand side, also this little boy, his cheeks are very puffy, so there'll be a little shadow over those as well. And I'll just work my way back down to my lightest color, adding a little bit of R20 just for their cheeks, and then blending that out with the E50. Next, I'll move on to their hair. And I wanted to make this little boy a little redhead. So there's not much hair here because their hats are covering up most of it. So I'm only using 3 colors here. Starting off with my darkest color, just adding a few little flicks on underneath where his hat is laying and where his hair is kind of curled over a little. Going with my mid-tone and then my lightest color. And then for my little girl, I'm going to make her kind of like a dirty blonde. And I've experimented with a lot of different color combinations for blonde hair. There's a lot that you can do just because there's so many variations of blonde. This one I've never tried before. But I go over the entire area with my lightest color, which is the E11, just to kind of lighten that up and make it more yellow because it is kind of like a goldish tint, the darkest color. Next, I will move on to their little outfits. And these are primarily going to be red, green, and white. So I'm starting off with my greens here. Starting with my lightest color, laying out my darkest areas. I'm pretty much going to color them the same. Their outfits aren't exactly the same, but they're very, very similar. So my darkest areas will be on either side of the hat because this is a rounder object, being it's on top of their head. You want to make sure that your highlight remains in the center. Also where their little collars hang over their outfits, underneath their little belts, and for their little socks, the shadow will be from the bottom up as well as their little elf shoes here, the darkest areas will be towards the bottom. Next, I'll go in with my darkest color, just adding a small amount of this darker color just in the very, very darkest areas. Again, going over the same spots that I initially put down my lightest color. Then I'll blend that out with my two mid-tone colors and then go back in with my lightest color. Now, I very rarely have my markers blob like this, but it seems like every time they do, it's when I'm recording. So what I do for this, and this is a darker color, I just kind of lay out my colorless blender and just let it sit there for a minute. Then I'll just continue going on with my coloring. I took the cap off the other end of the marker to prevent it from happening again. Then I'll continue to go back in with my colorless blender and take out a little bit more color each time. I'm not really worried about her sleeve being so dark because I can just go in with my white gel pen later to fix that. And I'll just change the color of the spoon. I was going to make it a wooden spoon, but I'll make that, I'll use my gray markers, and that'll cover up most of that green that still remains. Also, that will kind of move around your e-markers that you used for the wood grain on the cabinets. You can go back in once that colorless blender is dry. You can go back in and fix up any areas that may have taken away. Next, I'll move on to my reds, and I'm going to do the same exact thing. I'm going to make their little hats green and red stripes, and their little stockings, there'll be red and white. The collars will be red, and their little fringe, I guess, on the bottom of their little outfits will also be red. Starting off with my lightest color, which is actually a pretty light pink, going in with my darkest color and then blending that out. Now, I don't know what my deal was today. I could not stay in the lines. My colors were bleeding. But like I said, everything is fixable either with a colorless blender or a white gel pen. Sometimes you have certain colors in mind, but if your colors bleed, especially your reds, which are very hard to take out with a colorless blender, you may have to change that up. Their little sleeves, the end of their sleeves, I wasn't going to initially keep those white. I ended up having to do those white because of my markers bleeding. Some of these areas are really tiny and I didn't want to oversaturate the paper, so I just ignored the highlight color on some of these areas, which is that R20. Like their little stockings, there's certain parts of those that I won't even bother going in with my R20 for. As I'm going here, I'm going back in with my colorless blender and fixing up any areas. These are pretty intricate images, but I don't know, for some reason I was just felt like I was in a rush today and wasn't being overly careful. Next, for the bottoms of their hats and the stripes on their little stockings, I want these to be white. So I'm going in with my C3 and just adding where the shadows will be and then blending that out a little bit with my C1, not going all the way to the middle or to the edge. I want to leave some white, but I still want to have some shadow showing. For their little bells on their hats, I'm going to be also using my C markers, the C5, the C3, and the C1. Next, for the cookies and the cookie dough, I'm going to go in with my E30 markers. Now, this is a very similar color to the E50s that I used for the background. So I'm going to reserve a large highlight, which is the E30, which is significantly lighter than the rest of the background. But I am going to go in with my shadows with my E37, E33, and E31. Now this big mound of cookie dough that she's sitting on, I'm going to create my shadows underneath her, but I'm also going to put in some little wavy lines starting with my darkest midtone right in the center, kind of so that it's just not one big blob of cookie dough. It kind of looks like there is some texture. And then I'll blend that out with my lightest midtone and then go back in with my E30 and blend that completely out. Next, for my countertop, I'm going to go ahead and use my W markers, my warm gray markers. My darkest areas here will be off to most to the left-hand side, and also where her hat is kind of laying over top of the counter. I'll blend that out with my W5 and then go to my W1 and blend that out even more. I'll go back in with my C markers, this time using my C7, C5, and C3 for their little belts to make their belts look black. You want to make sure that you reserve a small highlight towards the center of their bellies because, like I said, this is a rounder object, so you just want to reserve a small highlight there. My C5, C3, and C1 will be for the spoon that she's holding. Next, I'll go ahead and color this canister, and I'm using some Y markers. These are kind of like a golden color. And again, highlights will be in the center for this because it is a round object, using flicking motions and keeping a very large highlight right there in the center to make it look shiny and round. Next, I colored his little cookie jar. This will be like a light gray. I'm using my warm grays here. I'm flicking that out, but leaving just, my highlight is actually white. I'm just leaving it white. I'm not going all the way to the end with my lightest color. And I'll pretty much do the same thing for her bowl there using my C markers. For the bowl on the countertop, I decided to add a little stripe there in the center so that I can incorporate the red and the green. And I'm coloring this the same exact way, starting off with my green, darkest areas on either side, blending that out with two midtones and leaving the highlight right there in the center. And then I'll go in with the same reds that I use on the elves and color the rest of the bowl the same exact way. For the center or the inside of the bowl, I wanted that to be white, so I'll go in with my C3 and my C1 marker and just add shadows to either side of it, blending that out to white in the center. Next, I'll go in and fix any areas that I messed up on. I'll create a few little highlights on their little bells and hats and shoes. And I'll also go over their belt buckles and their little cuffs of their sleeves to fix any areas where my markers bled or where that green marker had blobbed near where her spoon is. Next, I'll use some VersaFine ink and stamp my sentiment, which is the cutest sentiment in the world for this, right here in the center between my bowl and my canister. I took some Nuvo drops and added those for the little knobs of the cabinets. Now, I wish I would have put them up a little bit because where I had placed them initially, this little girl is in the way of putting one on the cabinet that she's sitting in front of. But I guess that doesn't really matter too much. I'll also take a sparkle pen by Nuvo and just add a little bit of sparkle to the little bells on their hats and their little shoes. I adhered this to an A2 size card base, and that is it for today. Thank you so much for stopping by and have a great day.